Hey everybody, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. First video in the new setup, and I thought it would be good to repot some of my smaller plants. So I've got a bunch of plants that need to be put on a pole, just need to be repotted because I just recently bought this, so it's not in my preferred mix just yet. Some might need some separating, but also might need to be put on a pole, and so on. So a variety of things that I need to do, and they're all in relation to some of the smaller plants that I've got. So I thought it might be nice to record it for you because it might be something a little bit more relatable. Most of the time when I do repotting, it's part of a chop and extend process with my moss poles. But I mean, it took me about a year or so until I was able to really do the first chop and extend because it requires your plant to actually grow up that moss pole. But I get a lot of questions in relation to potting up some smaller plants or what to do with smaller plants to get them to grow into larger plants as soon as possible. So I thought this might be a worthwhile exercise to take you through as well. Keep in mind, this is the first time I'm filming in this new setup. Normally I have my two mother grow lights sitting here and here so that the anthuriums get the prime spots. But while filming, I just moved them down to the floor. I hope the lighting is kind of consistent. I hope it's not too harsh. So on. Obviously, these lights are supposed to be for plants, not necessarily for filming. But I thought I'd keep them on anyway because it puts a bit of a spotlight on anything that I do on this table. But I'm sure over time, I'll figure out how to use this better. Alrighty, so maybe let's just start with the largest one and I park the rest on the side over here. Alright, this is a Syngonium Mojito. I recently got this from Bunnings, so it's still in the original mix that it came with. I mean, these roots look fine, these look healthy, so the plant didn't suffer too much living in that mix. And the mix is really nice and aerated as well, right? I mean, if I shake it, all of it comes off. What you don't want is your plant to be living in a mix that is really dense, so there's no availability for oxygen to get to the roots. So this looks good. However, what I don't like about these store-bought potting mixes or these mixes that a lot of plants come in is, first of all, usually they don't have the best aeration. Second of all, sometimes when you have plants in these store-bought mixes, they're still in one of these little death plugs. So when they're really small seedlings, often they're in these like mesh or like netted plugs, and often they're not removed before being repotted into a larger pot. So it's basically like suffocating the plant. So I always like to repot them to make sure they're not in a death plug. So I had two plants in this pot, perfect. And I can tell that these were propagated through cuttings. So probably that's why they didn't have a death plug. If they would have been tissue cultured and grown from a little seedling, then they'd probably come into it in a death plug. Alrighty, I've got a big tub of my aeroid mix over here. All my aeroids get my aeroid mix. If you're interested in learning more about my aeroid mix, I will have a full video on my aeroid mix linked in the description. The second reason why I like repotting is because I don't like using black pots. I just feel like there's a lot of guessing involved, whether the plant is happy or not, you know. Very common thing, people send me photos online asking me, hey, what's wrong with my plant? And the first thing I always tell them is, does the plant have a healthy root system? If your plant doesn't have a healthy root system, that might be the answer as to why some leaves are yellowing or why the plant is aborting new growth and so on. If the plant doesn't have a root system, it's not going to focus on growing leaves. What is it going to sustain these leaves with? Now, if your plant is unhappy and I tell you to check on its root system, you check the plant and then the root system was actually healthy, you basically just caused stress for the plant that was unnecessary. The plant is already struggling and going through something and you just had to take it out of its pot just to check the roots, just to confirm that the roots are actually healthy. If you do all of this with clear pots, you don't need to unpot your plant to know whether or not your plant has a healthy root system. Okay, let me just quickly do that. Beautiful. One down. It also really helps with watering. With the see-through pots, you can just actually see the moisture level within the mix. Specifically because I use a very chunky aeroid mix, there's a lot of air pockets. These air pockets are perfect for the aeroid roots because aeroid roots love oxygen and they love humidity. So there's basically small pockets of humid air containing a lot of oxygen. So the plants, the roots are attracted to that. So when I assess whether or not I need to water, all I really do is I look if the pot has condensation in it. If there's condensation in it, then there's still sufficient moisture within the medium. If you have black pots, then obviously you could use a moisture meter. Moisture meters are, in my opinion, very useless if you use a chunky aeroid mix, because chances are that your meter is just hitting one of these air pockets. It's going to tell you that it's dry, but it's not. Those moisture meters work well if you have a very, very dense medium, like for a fern or for a begonia or for a Hoya maybe. But for aeroids, if you use a chunky aeroid mix, the moisture meter is basically always going to tell you that your medium is dry, which is not the case. You can tell by the condensation. So I like to use the see-through pots because it helps me assess the actual moisture level, and then I can adjust my watering accordingly. Plus root health. Root health is definitely the first, and it also tells you kind of when you need to repot it. If you can only see roots, and it's probably a sign that you should be repotting. Comes in very, very handy when I do my chop and extends and I want to see if the chop and extend was successful. Are the roots expanding from the moss pole back into the pot? With a clear pot, that is brilliant. Now, this is Alocasia Aslani, I think that's how you pronounce it, I don't know. I put the name up on screen. It has some really cute, fine roots. So these roots are still fine because it's a small seedling, right? So these are not these really chunky aeroid mix that I'm expecting. I'm still using my normal aeroid mix that I always make, and it's usually very chunky. It's mainly, I mean, the main purpose of this aeroid mix is really potting up aeroids in moss pots, or my anthuriums love their really chunky aeroid mix as well. With these smaller plants, you can definitely use a much finer medium. I basically just go to the bottom of the bin and pick out the smallest bits of the medium, right? So I'll try to get small pieces of bark like this instead of having pieces of bark like this that go into the pot. So I'm not doing a specific mix for the smaller ones. I really just go to the bottom of the bin and I use that part of the aeroid mix. To be really honest, I just don't have the patience to customize the mix for every specific species or for every specific genus and so on. I kind of just give them the same treatment, and if they're not happy with it, then they're probably not my plant to grow. And look, honestly, I haven't noticed all too much difference. You might just, if you put it in a very chunky mix, you might just need to water a little more frequently, but I don't mind that at all. I am more likely to over than underwater my plants, so I prefer a mix that is chunky and allows me to water as much as I want, rather than going with a mix that is a little bit less maintenance. But personal preference, right? So on the topic of see-through pots, I know that they can be a little bit hard to source. Over here in Australia, they are readily available at Bunnings. You can also get them from growing grounds. So over here, it's really, really easy to get your hands on these. And they come in 3 sizes. I've got the 10, the 14, there's a 20 centimeter one as well. So unfortunately, it only comes in 3 sizes, and that's why I use these 3 sizes. Pretty much, like, I think 80% of my collection is in one of these 3 size pots. The crawlers are in like more elongated pots, and some of my larger moss pots, specifically where they're double planted or 2 moss pots next to each other, they're in 25 centimeter pots. And I just use normal black pots. And I'm struggling with them a little bit. I mean, it's fine. With moss pots, I don't struggle too much because I've got my care approach pretty down packed. But with all of my other plants, like anthuriums, for example, I heavily rely on the see-through pots to assess the root health and the watering. And if they were all in black pots, I would really have to change the way that I water or look after my plants. So to me, I'm heavily reliant on those. If you're not in Australia, I'm sure you can Google and see what sort of see-through pots might be available. I've seen people kind of DIY see-through pots as well by just using old soft drink bottles or using old Starbucks cups and so on, which is great. Like you're even recycling, or not recycling, you're repurposing plastic, which is great. I also reuse all of my pots. So, you know, all of the plants go from 10 to 14 to 20 centimeters. And then I always just wash the pot afterwards. Definitely washing is recommended because there could be bacteria in the pot from the potting medium, and they could potentially be harmful. I don't think so. I don't think they are. Otherwise, my plants would be suffering. But you don't necessarily want to introduce a brand new plant to the previous plant's medium. Just in case, just as a preventative, in case there's anything happening. Now, the other reason why I don't like the store-bought potting mixes is because they often come with fungus nets or other pests in them already. I get asked about fungus nets a lot, and I have very little to say because I've only ever had to deal with fungus nets once, and that was about 2.5 years ago. And it was on a Monstera that wasn't even on a moss pole. It was just potted up in a normal pot. Back then, I made an aeroid mix, but the aeroid mix was basically 50% store-bought potting mix that came with a little bit of slow-release fertilizer and perlite in it already, but honestly the smallest amount. And then I added a little bit of bark and perlite to that. The mix in itself was okay. I didn't really, like, my plants didn't die, but it was retaining a little bit too much moisture, and I was probably watering a little bit too much. Keep in mind, there was also early stages in my plant journey. So I had a bit of root rot, and fungus nets are attracted to rotting organic matter. So if you have root rot, that's what your nets will be attracted to. So basically, for you to prevent having nets, you should prevent overwatering. You should prevent root rot. And my aeroid mix that I now use, very chunky. I don't use any store-bought soil. It's technically a soilless medium. The water retentive part comes from the cocoa peat, and the nutrients are provided via liquid fertilizer weekly, right? So I don't need any of the soil or like compost or worm castings and so on. These sort of organic substrates often come with fungus nets in them already, or there might be a contributor to root rot, which then fungus nets are attracted to. So basically, in a nutshell, if you don't want fungus nets, the best way for them is to prevent them by not using store-bought potting mixes. And since I stopped using that, I just haven't had any net issues. That doesn't mean that I never see a net. Like every now and then I see a bloody net here and there, but I've never, like, I might see one a week. Maybe it's not even a net. Maybe that was just a fly. I don't even know. Anyway, I've got this teeny tiny El Choco red over here. It was a tissue cultured plant, and it came in just moss. It is a mess. It has, I think, like 3 or 4 shoots. It's very common for tissue culture that they just start reshooting in like so many little spots. So I think there's 3 or 4 shoots on here. But look at this. Can you see these little roots sticking out? I want to get that on a moss pole ASAP. Now, because it is such a tiny plant, I don't want to put it on one of my big moss poles just yet because I want to keep that one in my IKEA cabinet. So this one has been living in my IKEA cabinet since I got it delivered. It was shipped to me from WA. So I was like, okay, it's gone through a bit of a journey. WA is Western Australia, by the way. Sorry. So it's a bit of a journey to get here. So I thought, you know what, I'll give it its best chances of surviving by putting it in my prime spot in the IKEA cabinet, and it's really loved it. It's grown 2 leaves so far already. But I'm thinking if I want this to mature any further, I should start getting it on a moss pole. And at the same time, with the moss pole, I'm propagating it. This is a plant that is still fairly sought after in Australia. We only recently got this tissue cultured, and because we can't import plants, this plant was pretty much non-existent for the last 2 years. So I have plenty of friends who would like a cutting, so I want to propagate it straight away. I was actually having dinner with friends when we discovered this one on the website. And we were like, oh my god, let's get our hands on it. And we were all buying it online. And I actually snapped up the last one. So there was actually only one in stock. And I was just the fastest. We didn't know there was only one in stock. But when my friend tried to check out, it was sold out. And I literally just got my order confirmation. So I feel like I should give my friend a little cutting of this. So I want to propagate it ASAP. One moment, please. Remind me to put my mic back on when I come back, please. Oh, sorry. Thanks for the reminder. I'm loving this setup so far. It's like my little repotting station and talk to you guys. So I just got a little piece of wire so I can kind of pin this to the moss pole. Okay, let me bring you a bit closer. Can you see these roots here? Can you see these roots? Yeah. I just want to pin that to the moss pole so they can make contact. And because the moss pole is see-through, I will actually see when this was successful. So that's very good. Plus, so this is a grow vertical. I just cut it in half to make it a bit smaller. Plus, I can now just put my little clip on. So these are the little clips that I use in my IKEA cabinet. And I can just hang it back in my IKEA cabinet with the moss pole. I have one other moss pole in my IKEA cabinet, and honestly, it just basically never dries out because it's so nice and humid in there. So definitely shows that the moss pole is best used in a humid environment unless you're willing to consistently keep it moist. So the more humid the environment is that the moss pole is located in, the less work from your end. You know, I've seen people make like holes in the pot and then cable tie the pole to the pot and so on. I honestly just pot it up. It just stays in there and I can hang that up from there. I've done that plenty of times. Nothing ever happened. If something happens one day, it is totally my fault and I was basically asking for it. So yeah, I don't recommend that you do that, but I've done it and I've noticed no issues with it. So, Right, over here we've got a little Sharonii. There's two plants in here. This plant is funny because the roots are really dark. Can you see this there? So these roots are really dark and they almost look dead, like they don't look healthy. So I'm having like the hardest time assessing if this plant likes me or not. I'm having the hardest time assessing, is this plant ready for a repot? Until I spoke to AJ about it. And she actually said that this sort of plant has very dark roots. That's normal, which can be super confusing. I was like, yes, I'm confused. Thank you. So always good to have some really experienced growers around you who you can share some challenges with or share tips with and so on. So thank you, AJ, for letting me know. Same goes with the Tenyu, I think. The Tenyu also had really dark roots. I was just thinking, why is this so unhappy but growing leaves? Turns out it wasn't unhappy. The roots are just really dark. Alright, so this one goes on a moss pile. And I've put aeroid mix in the bottom half of the moss pile, the part that's going to be potted up. This is just a 14 centimeter pot. I don't think it needs much more than that. There are two plants in here and the existing mix is good. So I'm going to reuse as much of the existing mix as I can. Oh my god, this has like no roots. Another question I had was which side should be facing the moss pile. Now, I believe with these sort of plants, they don't have necessarily a side that should be facing the moss pile, but you can just check for aerial roots. If there are aerial roots sticking out on one side, then I would make that's the side that's facing the moss pile. But this plant, for example, has aerial roots sticking out 360. So doesn't really matter which side I'm choosing. The leaves will adjust and point towards the light anyway. So if the light source is coming from here, all the leaves will eventually face forward. So don't worry about which direction the leaves are facing at the time you're putting it on the moss pile. Okay, let me quickly top that up with more aeroid mix. Like, I want the mix to be densely packed. Or I mean, I don't want there to be huge gaps inside the pot. but I don't want to pack it too densely. I don't want to apply pressure. I just want to like shake it to get rid of any unnecessarily large empty bits. I like air pockets, I just don't want empty bits. There was like a second one. It was very, very small and has no good roots. So this one, I'll actually just put in a little bit of moss. So I'll just take the cutting. I'll wrap a little moss around it. I got rid of the excess. And then I just plug that in here. That easy. I give it a little clip and that's gonna hang in my IKEA cabinet. Now this plant with that big moss pole is now a little bit too big for the IKEA cabinet, so I will take it into my bedroom. Of course, whenever it comes out of perfect conditions and goes into now, like they're good conditions in my bedroom, but it's not going to be 90% humidity like it is inside the IKEA cabinet. So I'm definitely expecting a little bit of shock, but that's okay, right? Like at some stage there will be shock. So the sooner I get over it, the better. Alrighty. This is Philodendron rugosum, and I have 3 cuttings in here, or 3 seedlings in here, 2 seedlings in here. I'll show you a photo of what these look like in September. So 4 months ago, 3-4 months ago. So they've sized up really, really well. And they've also sized up really well because they've been in a prime spot in my IKEA cabinet. Now, this one I want to put on a pole. This one, there's 2 in here. I'm going to divide them because, friends, I spoke about money the other day in one of my YouTube videos, in the YouTube video where I talk about all of the newer plants that I've gotten. Where I talk about money and like how much some of these have cost, and I try to avoid that topic usually because it's so different depending on whereabouts in the world you live, right? Like whatever I paid over here, if I tell you I paid $100 for this over here, well, first of all, you might not necessarily know what 100 Aussie dollars are in your currency, and then second of all, you don't know what the cost of living in Australia is. Maybe $100 in Australia is not much. Maybe $100 is a lot, right? Like what's the minimum wage? So you need to put that sort of stuff in relation. But I don't like to talk too much about money because people don't put it in relation and just get really judgy. Like, oh my God, I can't believe you spent this much on a plant without actually knowing all of the background and so on. So, and that's not necessarily conversations I want to have on the internet. So I usually just avoid these conversations. But I had really positive feedback because people actually found it valuable and they were able to put their plant purchases in context. 1 second. So I've got a lot of really positive feedback on it because people were saying it helps them put their plant purchases in perspective. But be careful with that. Maybe if I say I spend $100 on a plant, but the same plant is actually coming out of tissue culture a couple of months later, and you could get it for $30 at Bunnings, then $100 is actually a bad deal. If you live in a country where they might not be available through tissue culture anytime soon, and the value of the plant remains higher because there's less supply but still high demand, then maybe $100 would be a really good investment, and maybe within a cutting or two, you actually return you make a return on your investment, right? I mean, I don't see plants as an investment, even though they are. I mean, I'm investing in future content essentially when I get plants. But yeah, again, wow, I spent so much time talking about money again. I need to stop. Why did I even start this conversation? Let me think about it. Oh yeah, the reason I started this conversation is because realistically, I don't know how much a lot of these plants cost, and I honestly don't spend much money on plants either because most of the plants that I've gotten are from swaps. I always make an effort to propagate plants when they're still small. Before I start growing them as my mother plant, I like to propagate them and then share and swap small plants with friends. Or, you know, there might be like 2 plants that I'm after and a friend might be also after the same 2 plants. And we say, well, why don't you get this one, I get this one, and then we get one, give one to each other. Sorry, I just poked that in way too much earlier. It's too dense. I don't like it that dense. It's very heavy and uses a lot of moss and not a lot of aeration. So I'm just kind of fluffing it up a little bit again. Over here in Australia, we've got the Aeroid Society of Australia as well. They have like member meetups where you can swap plants and so on. So I can't necessarily help you unless you're in Sydney itself. If you're in Sydney, definitely check out the Aeroid Society. They do a lot of swap events. Maybe AJ and I will be creating a little plant event as well if there's some demand in Sydney, maybe over winter, because in winter is usually when the community goes really quiet anyway. And yeah, if you're international, just reach out to other plant people in your country. I wouldn't know necessarily, but definitely try and swap as many plants as you can. I know at the beginning it's kind of like you feel like, oh my God, this is my plant. I don't want to cut it up and give it to somebody else. But honestly, as soon as you start getting over that fear of chopping your plants and you just actually start appreciating propagation, your whole plant journey will change. Honestly, it's a game changer. I lost that fear very, very early on. I don't think I've ever really had that fear. I mean, sometimes there's definitely some plants that I cut up and I was like, I'm nervous, I've never done this before and I have no idea if it works, but I wouldn't classify it as a fear. But yeah, all right, so let's take this out of here. I believe this is just in moss and there's 3 plants in here, so I reckon it will be well rooted. You can definitely not see this on camera, I think, but there are definitely some roots stuck in the moss. Now I'm trying to separate the roots from the moss over here because that moss, if I pot it in here, is going to have a little bit too much water retention. I want the moss to be in the pole only, not inside the mix. So let's see. But at the same time, I don't want to disturb the roots. That would also defeat the purpose. So it's a good medium between, being gentle, but also maybe giving up at some stage. See how we go. I'm not the most patient person with these things, and that's by far the biggest downside to moss. Anyway, where is I? So yeah, definitely swap. Another question I got a lot in relation to smaller plants is, or in relation to potting up plants, is when you should be potting them up, right? I mean, potting plants up, the principle is always the same. If you put a moss pole on it or not, doesn't really matter. You want to pot up your plant once it has a decent root system. If it doesn't have a decent root system, I would keep propagating it in moss or in water. Decent root system obviously depends on the size of the plant. If you have a huge plant with one tiny root, that is not a decent root system in relation to the plant itself. If you have a teeny tiny plant like this and it has 2-3 roots, like that is proportionally okay. So why not pot it up? And then the size of the pot you choose based on the size of the root system as well. So you don't choose that based on the size of the plant, you choose it based on the size of the root system. So you might have a chunky anthurium stem, with no leaves on it, but a lot of roots because you've gotten like the base of the cutting. Well, you don't pot it into a tiny pot just because it has no leaves. You're potting it into a larger pot because it has a lot of roots. The leaves will come. So always judge the size of the pot based on the size of the root system. I personally like to go a little bit smaller than probably the average person online. A few reasons for that. First of all, it saves me substrate, it saves me space, but also with a smaller pot, you're having less risk of overwatering because there's just not that much medium in there that could retain moisture. But you then also need to provide water more frequently. So more frequent watering because the medium can't retain that much moisture, but also because there's not that much medium. However, when you put it on a moss pole, that's where you need to find a bit of a compromise. So based on the root system of these tiny plants, I should probably give it a 10 centimeter pot, but it's kind of unrealistic to fit that moss pole in a 10 centimeter pot. Plus there's 3 plants. Once they start growing, they'll fill out this pot, the 14 centimeter pot, in no time, right? So ideally, I wouldn't use such a large pot, but I still think it's reasonable. It's not like I'm putting it in a 25 centimeter pot with like essentially no roots on it. So yeah, if in doubt, I would rather use smaller pots and repot more often. But then also really the sizes of the pots that I use, as I mentioned earlier, are heavily determined based on which sizes are available in see-through. So I'm honestly not overcomplicating it. I'm not making a huge like science out of this. I'm just winging it. Okay, these three are like really tightly, so you can see there's 3 shoots on here. They're really tightly rooted together over there. I don't know if I want to try and separate them or not. It would be good so I can kind of space them out on the grow vertical pole a bit. But I also don't want to ruin them. If you're an impatient person, definitely make plants your hobby because it teaches you a lot of patience. Alright, and then another really very frequently asked question I get is obviously in relation to watering moss poles. Now, I've spoken about watering moss poles so much. I even have a 2-part series combined. They're like I think almost 2 hours long of me watering my entire collection. So if you're just interested to see how I water my collection and basically I talk you through my thought process while I do it, definitely check out those videos. They're in my moss pole playlist. But in a nutshell, I usually water the moss pole, and then the gravity is then just making the water drain through the pot and then into the planter, and then I empty out the planter with any excess water. Done. However, of course, when for example, this plant, I just put on the moss pole. Why would I bother watering the entire moss pole? There's nothing here. The idea is that the plant I'll do it. It's kind of like the opposite way for you guys, but I'm just going to pin these over here now with a little piece of wire. So let me just do that while I talk to you. So it would kind of be a lot of work, and it kind of would be, to water the full moss pole if it hasn't attached yet. Well, roots are attracted to moisture, so if you keep the moss pole moist, the roots are more likely to actually find their way into the moss pole. So you do want to keep the pole moist, but you don't need to keep the entire moss pole moist at this stage. Right now, I would just basically use a spray bottle to make sure that the bottom part where the plant is touching the pole, that part stays moist, so that the plant's first aerial roots, like I showed you the ones from the El Choco, like we want those to be attracted to that water, grow into the moss pole, and then not die. If you keep the moss pole crunchy, those roots will just die because, well, roots need moisture. Essentially treat the pot like you would treat a medium. Another thing to consider is that when you water your moss pole, water drains from the top to the bottom, which makes the top dry out first and the bottom stays moist the longest. Now, if you don't fill your moss pole to the top, or if you only water your moss pole to here, then the top is here and the top dries out first and the plant is touching the top, meaning that you might need to water more frequently because the plant is constantly at risk of drying out. Whereas if I water the full moss pole, it will slowly dry out over the week, but the bottom will stay moist all week long. So I have much less work to do if I water the full moss pole. Yeah, so these are the little, they're decent sized, huh? I'm gonna do I put 3 on here? Worst case scenario, I'll take them off again and they're all nicely propagated. So basically, I just choose based on how I feel like if I want to water the full moss pole or not. If you water the full moss pole, keep in mind right now, for example, this moss pole is so dry and dry moss is hydrophobic, that moss pole would make a mess. So you would need to slowly water the moss pole first until it's no longer dry, then it's not hydrophobic, and then it can absorb a lot of water, which is probably what you're after. Alright, so I pinned those 3 to here now, and now I just fill it up with more aeroid mix. Again, I'm going to the bottom of the bucket for the more fine bits of my aeroid mix. So yeah, I'll just wing it. Usually, if I want to water the full moss pole, I try and just water a little bit every couple of days. That way it never dries out, it never gets hydrophobic, and it makes my watering experience really easy. If you don't have that sort of time available and you just want to do it once a week, I would just wet the top of the moss pole first a little bit and then flip the water bottle upside down, and then the water is going to be released really, really slowly as the moss start sweating and absorbing a little bit more. But that's just what I do. You can do whatever works for you and your plants and your time available, your approach, your mix, your medium, right? Like all of that. There's so many elements that could impact the way you need to water and look after your plants. So judge your watering requirements based on the medium you use, but I believe the principle should always be the same. You want to keep your moss pole moist so that the roots can find their way into the moss pole, and then the moss pole will turn these roots into proper water roots and make them part of the root system. Beautiful, here we go. 3 in 1. And this one are the same, also 2 rugosums, but I want to separate them. Now, the grow vertical moss poles definitely make watering much easier. So I would say I probably water them half as often as I water my normal moss poles. However, because it maintains moisture more, you also run risk of potentially overwatering or potentially the roots not having enough aeration. Potentially, if you don't have enough airflow, higher chances of mold and definitely more algae buildup. Now, algae buildup in itself is nothing negative, right? No, the algae is not competing with the plant for nutrients to the extent that it would harm your plant. So we can all be relaxed about that and no need to worry and stress. But I would still just be a little bit more careful with watering the grow verticals, but which is probably what most people want. They are complaining about the frequency of watering moss poles. I don't know why everybody, like, I mean, of course it's 2023. People love complaining, full stop. Doesn't really matter what it is. People love complaining, like, your video is too short, your video is too long. Wherever there's anything, like, people will always find a reason to complain. So that's a given. But I love watering my moss poles. I see every watering as an opportunity to make my plants thrive and grow in the best way possible. Like, I just don't appreciate that whole idea of let's try and do as little as possible but expect the most amazing results. I just think usually results are a reflection of your effort. Now, of course, your effort doesn't always need to be working hard. You can also be working smarter. So if you find a smart way to achieve the same with less effort, good on you. But to me, this is also a hobby. This is like a hands-on hobby to me. I have an office job. I sit on a computer all day and and so on. So I love getting my hands dirty. I love doing the watering. It's like my little timeout. I have no desire in trying to automate this so that I essentially have to do nothing anymore. That to me defeats the purpose. Okay, I think the only one, this one, same here, still in its Bunnings mix, a cute little Clarinervium. Let's have a look if this one was in a death plug or not. Oh my god, look at these roots! Ah, those are sexy roots. Claries just have the chunkiest roots of them all, don't they? Also, I'm not super fussed, like with like a little bit of medium left in here. I mean, the plant was healthy. If I know that there would have been root rot, I would maybe give this a little shower to get rid of all of the little dirt that's still on here. But look at these roots. Oh my god, that is exciting. Can't wait to get them into a see-through pot so I can actually spy on them. Like, what a waste not being able to look at these beautiful roots. Okay, let me just put it in aeroid mix. That's too loud for me to talk over. I think we have one more. This one had a little bit of root rot and I've just been growing it in moss for the last few weeks. First root is starting to come out the bottom, so I'm thinking it is probably time to put this back into aeroid mix. This is a Clarinervium hybrid. I think they call it square heart, and it has been hybridized with Macrolobium, I believe. That's what gives it a little more squarish shape. Alright, I get rid of all the moss. That was easy because it didn't root all too much yet. Beautiful. Definitely also has roots in multiple spots, right? So, for example, one thing I try and avoid when potting up a plant is trying to pot up a plant that just has one root coming out from its stem or from one node. Because what if you by accident break or snap the root as you're potting it up and you might not even notice it? The plant essentially just lost its one lifeline and that's it. But over here, I've got a root here, I've got one here, I've got here, like plenty of roots. So even if something would go wrong while potting it up, I have plenty of lifelines. Beautiful. And then with my anthuriums, I like to give them a little layer of moss on top. Couple of things. As anthuriums slowly climb, yes, they are climbers. You could totally put them on a moss pole as well if you would like. They just climb really slowly. So don't give them a large one. You could give them a grow vertical. I would recommend definitely grow vertical because the roots also like moisture. You could even cut this one in half and just give them a half pole because the plant is going to grow really slowly or climb really slowly. But as it climbs, each node is going to have these little aerial roots that are going out, and you would want the aerial roots to then make contact with the moss. Now in here, because they climb so slowly, I don't really need a pole in itself, but what I want to do is I want any new nodes that's coming up, I want the roots to be attracted by the moisture of the moss, and then the moss is just kind of funneling them back into the pot where they can then expand. It also builds a little barrier because my mix is very chunky. A lot of water can evaporate. So that way I keep the chunky aeroid mix almost like sealed. And then it builds all of these nice little humid air pockets inside. And apparently, but don't quote me on, apparently it's beneficial for the pH and so on as well. So I think I'm done. Let me just quickly clean up and just double check that I've gotten them all. Alrighty, I'm happy with my efforts. I hope you learned something from this video. I really just kind of repotted them and just really spoke about things that came to my mind. That wasn't super structured, but I hope I was still able to bring across a lot of useful information that you can apply to your own plants and your own plant journey. Definitely time for me to go ahead and water all of these plants, so I'll wrap it up. Subscribe, like, and comment on this video if you enjoyed it. Please share this video as well with other people that you think might be interested in learning more about my approach to plant care. I would really love to reach wider audiences. Thank you so much again, and I'll see you next time around. Bye!